Well, I will take program director's prerogative here, and I was very intrigued by your article on the fusion centers that you had in the Washington Times, and could you please expound upon these fusion centers and kind of give us your assessment on their threat to our liberty, if you think they are, and how much of a threat they might be?
Well, remember that the fusion centers are part of this cluster of response to 9/11, which again magnified the fear of international terrorism a millionfold and said, oh, we got to do something. It's of the same genre that gave us the military commissions and gave us the enemy combatants and gave us the illegal terrorist surveillance program and all the other horrors, the torture and whatever. And so the idea after 9/11, even though the 9/11 Commission found that no matter what had happened before, it wasn't an absence of intelligence sharing that caused 9/11 to occur. It was flukish in some respects, but it wasn't because we weren't collecting intelligence. And moreover, how are you going to collect the intelligence? This idea that there's some kind of paradigm of a terrorist is ridiculous. People say, oh, these people, they grow up in impoverished, unfree circumstances. Well, Osama bin Laden was as rich and privileged a kid as you can imagine. You know, he was born into a huge, wealthy estate, and at least half the so-called 9/11, the 19 on the planes, they were educated. They didn't suffer. They weren't suffering privation at all. The other half were there probably because they got paid. But this idea of fusion centers, okay, now we're going to recruit 800,000 state and local law enforcement officers to spy on everybody and everything without telling us. And they'll focus on non-criminal intelligence and seek to create profiles. This is what a terrorist looks like. And they will then share this information, have the ability to move it back and forth everywhere. So a policeman, this is what Jane Harmon, the chairman of the committee, said at that hearing, it'll be a policeman on the beat who will then stop that next Osama bin Laden from rearing his head. And it's, in my mind, utterly lunatic. You just get reams of information, so they don't know what to do with it all, because there isn't any way in which you sort out, oh, this is a person who's likely to be terrorist, this or not. And because terrorism is described in substantial part with wanting to change government policy, you then start spying on people who want to change government policy, whether it's the death penalty, whether it's the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, it could be same-sex marriage. And you're dealing with these foot soldiers who are like the immigration officials as well. I worked in the Department of Justice for 15 years, so I know what the level of intelligence is, and it's not what you'd want to entrust anybody with a sense of a decision to make. So they just go gather everything. I mean, the absurdity of suggesting, oh, you spoke at Ron Paul's Liberty Convention. Oh, you're libertarian. People here. Okay, that's an earmark of terrorism. No. Because there's a correlation. People who don't like the government don't like Ron Paul. No, maybe they think the government's policies are wrong because they are wrong. You know, that's what freedom means. And so we have these unknown thousands of people gathering intelligence on us, information, we don't even know where it goes or what's done with it. No, what we do know is that it's solved not a single crime whatsoever, and it's squandering just countless resources. You know, with a murder clearance rate of 61, that ought to be 90, you know, or 95. And yet, no, since it's 9/11 and you get the money, the federal government gives the money, then you develop these spy programs, and hey, then you have nice employment. And of course, what do if you're out there gathering intelligence? You got to find something. Otherwise, you'll be unemployed. Hey, you didn't give an intelligence report today. One of the oddities, I mean, sort of hilarious in a very obtuse way, of this North Texas Fusion Center was the intelligence reports that I was described about how Islamic radical fundamentalism is gaining ground politically in the United States. It was placed adjacent to another, this terrorism intelligence report, with another report on how the cattle in North Texas have to be protected in the event of another natural disaster and drought. How you can respond very quickly to that. You read them, this is part of the same, these are the intelligence collection people. It shows, you know, how discriminating minds they have. You know, searching for Islamic radicalism and protecting the cattle in a natural disaster to agriculture out there. And so what's the danger is we have a society that starts to look like the Stasi in East Germany. They're just collecting information without any discrimination, not telling us where it is. There's no Right to Privacy Act where we know what's being collected on us. We don't know where the information ends up. Is it at a bank? Is it an enemy? Is it an employer's office or otherwise? Do we end up on a watch list? Again, part of the greatest danger to the freedom is we don't know what the government's doing anymore. But we surely can anticipate that is collecting information on our First Amendment activities, because that's the first thing that makes them suspicious. Oh, you're against the government, then you must be a Timothy McVeigh, or not that, Osama bin Laden. And I would, lobby Congress, shut these damn things down. Get them to focus on crime. With murder rates what they are, having all those resources trying to prosecute those who are guilty of murder and take away this idea of spying on Americans and making dissent the equivalent of disloyalty or treason.
I wonder if you have an opinion on the relationship of the drug war and the massive growth of domestic police forces and as well as I guess some international activities on the front of fighting against illegal drugs, and how that maybe has allowed some of the surveillance kind of activities and the other kind of spying on citizens to be able to occur, because it's kind of already so big. We're already doing so much that it isn't as noticeable that we're kind of extending into these new areas with the war on terrorism.
Well, I think that's a very astute observation. It was James Madison who said it's right to be alarmed at the first encroachment on our freedom. And if you look at the drug war, and I was in government at the time that emerged in the early 1970s, it's a precursor to where we are today. Because it was, first of all, the use of language, metaphor, a war. It then indicates, well, then we should have all the implements or powers of war in order to fight the drug cartels. Secondly, it was the drug war that initiated the use of the military for law enforcement purposes. Then they were to interdict. The military would, those who were trying to smuggle drugs in abroad. So here we have some breakdown in what we call the Posse Comitatus Act that generally makes it illegal for the military to be involved in domestic law enforcement. And then we have, because it's drugs and it's largely what they call victimless crime in the sense that you have willing buyers and willing sellers, then requires all the surveillance that you've described. In fact, the initial efforts to use electronic surveillance and wiretapping emerged during the Prohibition era to try to get bootleggers because they couldn't get the evidence otherwise. And that was one of the very great first disasters of the United States Supreme Court. In 1928, a case called United States versus Olmstead, where the court held that there were no Fourth Amendment protections for conversations because the words of the Fourth Amendment speak of protecting persons, houses, papers, and effects. And then Chief Justice William Howard Taft said, I don't see conversations in there, so I guess it doesn't apply. It would be like reading the authority in Article 1 to create a Navy and armed forces to exclude Air Force because, hey, it's not Air Force there. You can't fly planes. Where is it? And that's real genius there legally. And it took 40 years before the Supreme Court finally reversed that decision in a case called Katz versus the United States. But this is exactly that kind of effort to go after transactions in a very aggressive way that don't threaten society, that certainly paved the way to use surveillance otherwise. Now, I don't want to say that terrorism is like drugs. In some sense, the surveillance in the terrorism area is more dangerous because whatever you can say about the mindlessness of the drug war, you're not focusing on political activity. Those who are smuggling drugs aren't challenging government policy or whatever. They want to make money. But with regard to the terrorism, it's so blended with politics. That's where you get the real danger. They'll start equating legitimate democratic activity with crime, which is the death knell of a republic. You can't have that. The citizens need to be encouraged. There's too little democratic activity, not too much. And when you create this aura out there that, hey, if you go out there and you protest, you demonstrate, you'll be in a spy file that the fusion centers will compile, ordinary human nature for many will say, all right, I don't want to get bothered. I have a hard enough time. I don't want to be hassled at the airport. I better just not say or do anything, which is, say, a real injury to the vitality of the democratic polity.